Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Lucie Edwards on science and international public policy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And I'm happy every week to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation a noted expert in some aspect of international public policy or global governance. And today I have a very distinguished guest, a distinguished Canadian diplomat from years past who has served in a variety of roles, including as Canada's High Commissioner to Kenya, South Africa, and India, our ambassador to the United Nations Environment Program, and also ambassador to the Commission on Sustainable Development. Most importantly, Lucie is completing her doctorate here at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. So welcome, Lucie, and you're doing work on science and international public policy.
I am.
And I think a lot of us would hope and assume that science and international public policy work hand in glove, but obviously it's much more complicated relationship than that. So maybe we can start just by your general characterization of the international public policy world and the scientific world, and how well or how difficult it is for them to speak to each other.
Well, I often say that public policymakers, people like me, come from Mars, scientists come from Venus, and somewhere between them they have to take care of the Earth. And they don't always speak to each other as effectively as you might think. They have different worldviews, different training, different ways of approaching problems. And while one would think that two different worldviews brought together would be more enriching and I think would result in better public policy, sometimes there are pretty fundamental questions of communication between how they see problems. To give one example, in both cases I think there's kind of a sense of a transmission line that science would identify the problem and explain it to the policymakers, and the policymakers would then make decisions. It's not always so easy. It should be more iterative to understand the relationship. Policymakers are incredibly busy. They tend to do what in economic terms is called satisficing, find out as easy a solution to manage the problem as they can, whereas scientists really like to get into something in depth. There's this wonderful story about the chief scientific advisor to President Kennedy, Harvey Brooks, who used to go and try to speak to the president about some of the really critical issues like nuclear nonproliferation. He'd always be given about 10 minutes, and he would be 9 minutes into his peroration, and the president would be looking at his hand before he'd actually kind of come up with any kinds of recommendations. Right. It's that kind of communications challenge which can be a real difficult problem for them. I'm looking at specifically 3 cases where scientists and public policymakers are actually sitting in the same room dealing with problems together and trying to develop common strategies and approaches for dealing with the problems. The most famous one is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but I'm also looking at similar panels that have been set up to deal with the food security crisis, including the issue of GMOs and the use of GMOs in the third world, and the whole question of biodiversity and the crisis scenarios such as forestry. Again, how scientists and public policymakers are trying to come and talk to each other effectively in the same room.
I'd like to talk about each of those in some detail a little bit later, but before we get there, is it fair to say that the communications flow is generally one way, that the scientists provide information and knowledge and evaluations of possible solutions to problems, and that the policymakers are consumers of this information, or is it more of a two-way flow? And if so, what's going the other direction?
I would say actually that there isn't enough communications, period. That much of what actually happens, what is understood in the scientific area, generally doesn't get out of that community into the hands of policymakers. So even a one-way flow would be, in many ways, an improvement on what we have at the moment. But you're quite right, there is a question of how much, at least of an understanding of how the policy process takes place, gets to the scientific community to understand, what the needs are in terms of material that would be really user-friendly for the use of policymakers. And to give you an example of that, very often the conversation when it takes place, it all has to do essentially with how much money can science get. It becomes a matter of the integrity of the scientific project, rather than can science and the way scientists think actually result in higher quality public policy making. scientists scarcely ever in any country in the world end up in positions of leadership within the public policy environment. That's essentially the domain of lawyers and economists. Even less at the international level do they play a role. The organizations where scientists deal with one another tend to be all scientists all the time talking to each other. And the extent to which there's a dialogue, it's managed by people that I call, the science managers, who are bilingual and bicultural, who can talk policy, but who are themselves respected figures within the scientific community. They tend to be people like prime ministers' advisors on science, issues of that kind. But there aren't that many of them. Here in Canada, we don't have one. And their ability to actually sort of raise up the flag and say, hey, you need to know something's coming down, that's very, very important in terms of policy, is constricted. And that's a serious concern about our ability to deal with the big problems that are coming down.
And is the main obstacle time constraints? Policymakers can't pay enough attention to the scientists to get a communication going? Is it cultural, that they just live in different universes and don't really understand each other's needs? Or is it a language issue, that they don't understand the words the other side uses?
I think it's all of the above.
All of the above.
I think all of the above. And it may also have to do, I think a lot of it has to do, where I think they're beginning to come together, is this whole question of what is a fact? The whole thing that, if you're your ambition is to uncover facts or have some sense of reality, which is the essence of the scientific project. From the perspective of a policymaker, things are very different. And certainly what's been very interesting has been as they begin to have a conversation about issues of risk, because that actually is language where they can both come together. Scientists less and less are talking about objective facts, and they're talking about their best guess about the state of reality, which is, in their mind, constantly flowing. And I think that in that sense, when they talk about what are the potential consequences, for example, something like climate change, as opposed to how fast are the oceans rising, they're actually dealing with something which is that policymakers can really get their teeth on.
Right.
But I think it's true, and I say this as a former policymaker who worked in these environments. If you're a policymaker, you live in the equivalent of living inside a popcorn machine. The issues are bouncing and popping off the walls all the time. You have very little time. There's an incredible amount of noise to the amount of signal. And on the one hand, you both desperately want someone who can give you a roadmap to get out to where you need to go. On the other hand, it's very hard for you to focus on just one thing. And I think that sense of what are the cultural challenges that policymakers face is something that would be very helpful for scientists to come to understand.
I imagine so. We'll be back again in a moment with Lucie Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. You mentioned climate change, so let's start with climate change, and you mentioned facts. And of course, when I think of climate change and facts, I think of Al Gore and an inconvenient truth, which makes very hard claims about certain facts. Al Gore was a policymaker, not a scientist, but he was very good at, I assume, consuming science and communicating science to a policy audience.
And it's worth noting that he won the Nobel Peace Prize at the same time as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did. And the Nobel laureate's endorsement made the point about the linkage between this partnership that had taken place between an advocate and a policymaker who'd been building on the hard work that had been done by the scientists within the IPCC. So I think that is a good example of the kind of partnership that would take place. The IPCC itself is a fascinating institution. It's probably the oldest one where we've actually seen scientists and policymakers sitting in the same room dealing with these. It dates back actually to a Canadian event, the Toronto Conference on the atmosphere, where in fact the notion of an IPCC was endorsed in the run-up to the Rio Conference and was directly created in order to have something that policymakers could chew on when it came to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, and it continues to work. It's now working on the 5th review, and there are many thousands of scientists from around the world now engaged in actually doing an update of what they understand about the science at the moment. But it's an interesting one because over in the most recent meeting, over 127 countries came together with the scientists in the same room to deal with the whole question, which is, I guess, the liveliest question in climate change. Can we now draw a very direct link between the natural disasters we're seeing and climate change. And how can we define that very carefully?
In the extreme weather events we're seeing.
The extreme weather, the natural disasters, and so on. The interesting thing is they use my work, my kind of job, which is words, to figure out, they jointly write the text, and they use both scientific language and they use diplomatic language to try to describe what they see is happening. So for the first time, scientists are acting with diplomats trying to write international language. There's no question that it's changing both groups. That the people who participate in that process see themselves as a kind of an IPCC community, going back to the work that Peter Haas has done about epistemic communities. And they've actually come up with a whole community of science managers, people who are bilingual and bicultural. And to that extent, it becomes an interesting example of how we can deal with other problems. And in fact, people have said, going beyond the issues of environmental science, that perhaps the model of the IPCC could be used to deal with other issues like global public health.
So in your view, the IPCC works very well internally?
I think the IPCC has a number of challenges. The scientists who work on it will be the first to say that. It's become very big. I mean, you know, it's just, you need a Napoleon to manage that many thousands of scientists who are now involved in the process. It becomes slow for that reason. The science itself is becoming extraordinarily more complex, so writing it is a challenge. And then they try to boil it all down essentially into an advisory executive report that goes to policymakers to do it. So it isn't perfect. There are real north-south types of issues associated with it as well, because it's largely dominated by scientists from the north who are the people doing the research. But yes, I think that it really has defined the agenda in terms of climate change. And it's become something of an authoritative document. If you read anything about climate change, there's always going to be a line that says, according to the IPCC.
Right.
And that sort of is embedded an aspect about what people currently think about things.
But when you see that line, it's always followed by some factual statement, right?
Yes.
It's not followed by some policy prescription.
Yeah, they actually have a mantra of the IPCC that's been adopted by the other intergovernmental commissions that says that they are policy specific but not policy prescriptive. They do go beyond just collecting the facts to coming up with options, but they make it very clear that the decisions have to be made by policymakers, whether at the national level or within international gatherings. So they do see a bit of a transmission line between what they do and where decision making takes place.
So the problem with dealing with climate change is not sort of upstream, where the science meets the public policy. It's downstream, where the policymakers in different countries get together and completely fail to come up with any solutions to the problems identified upstream.
Up to a point, the IPCC itself has been attacked quite brutally within the whole climate change skeptic community. And although in fact it has integrated from the beginning the climate change skeptics within their own work, it has been pretty badly beaten up over the years within those kinds of debates over what the science actually says. In fact, one of the great climate scientists, Dr. Schneider, who was involved from the beginning in the organization, has said that climate science is a contact sport. You shouldn't go into the IPCC without wearing your helmet and watching out for high sticking. So I would say that, in fact, the scientists find this combination of policy debate with science a fairly brutal process.
But the scientific skeptics within the IPCC aren't saying climate change is not happening and human activity is not. They're saying we don't know enough.
No, for quite a long time.
But today they don't say.
They said it. Nowadays they wouldn't.
They don't.
No, there's
Okay.
a consensus in favor of it. But in fact, within the organization, and certainly for the first few reviews, there were very strong voices of skepticism, often coming from the weather community, that in fact, because a lot of the work on climate change was based on computer modeling rather than observation,
Right.
that they weren't absolutely certain. It was the work that came out of Hawaii and some of the work that came out of Antarctica and ice core and so on that has won over the scientists within it. But
not certain that it's happening is not the same as certain that it's not happening. We just don't see that latter category anymore.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, they've come to the point where, from having observed that there was, in the first important statement they said was climate change is happening. The second important statement they made was climate change is indeed anthropocentric. It's caused by human activity, to the point where they were saying, and we are feeling the effects now, to the current debate, which is, and it's causing natural disasters. And that's not yet a consensus within it. That's where they've gone through. But it's been a very lively fight, both among the policymakers participating in the process, some of whom, like the Saudi Arabians, who were in senior positions and very skeptical, and the scientists themselves, because they did bring in the voices of skeptics from the beginning of the process.
Very good. We'll be back again in a minute with Lucie Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Lucie mentioned food security as another issue you've been working on. How is the science policy interface different there compared to climate change?
It's different in a sense because the organizers of the big intergovernmental assessment on science and technology for agriculture decided to amp it up, so it wasn't just a conversation between policymakers and scientists. When they created what's called ISTAD, that particular intergovernmental panel, they also brought in representatives of the civil society in a very, almost like a socially engineered way. They made sure that most of the representatives of food groups, agricultural groups, farmers associations, and so on participated. So it was more of a triangle between civil society, state representatives, and scientists to talk over the future of food security. And they were quite informed. It was created after the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development, on the grounds that agriculture and food security was the issue of all of the issues of sustainable development that affected most people in the world, and they were very much informed by the concern over what climate change might do to affect it. It was a hugely ambitious effort that they did. But there were some specific issues that were really bedeviling the community at the time, the most important of which was GMOs, because it looked like the world was dividing into two camps: a pro-GMO camp, which included most of the Americas, and an anti-GMO camp, which was Europe. And the third world, the developing world, wasn't sure how they felt about GMOs. Brazil, Argentina, a few countries, South Africa had embraced them, but for much of Africa and Asia, there was real uncertainty over them. And it was an issue where the scientists and the international community were totally at odds over the credibility of the science. It was thought that perhaps a really intensive effort could solve these scientific disputes. And they could deal with some larger issues, which I would say philosophically come down to, is the solution for agriculture and food security as we look ahead really a matter of equity and distribution? In other words, making sure the food is distributed to the right places. Or is it really a matter of productivity? Do we need to drastically increase our productivity in light of the fact that we're expecting several more billion people by the end of the century? So how do we actually deal with it? And at the same time, protect forest cover, deal with the protection of the environment as a whole. So there were huge issues to deal with food security. It was an enormously ambitious effort, and it failed, which is what's quite interesting. There was no agreement on scientific safety issues associated with GMO.
No agreement among the scientists.
No agreement among the scientists, no agreement among the countries. They continued to agree to disagree, and they still do to this day. The report was tabled in 2009.
I've met scientists who say it's absolutely safe.
And you'll meet scientists
I've met scientists who say we're not sure.
Yes.
Are there any that say evidence suggests that they're unsafe?
Absolutely. If you would go to Europe, you would find many. Here in Canada, you would meet many. There is really profound disagreement on this issue. And it looks now like we might be coming towards some kind of an understanding, but it was a fundamental issue. And the other issues, which are almost kind of a social scientist, agricultural producer debate over should we be increasing productivity at all costs, or should we be looking at issues of organic agriculture and better distribution, emphasis on food processing, and so on, are also issues that are still not completely resolved. So one of the things that the ISTAD process identified is you bring all the best people in the room, well over 100 countries participated, several thousand scientists, and sometimes you just will not get an agreement. You won't get a consensus. there are people who will say that this was a high watermark in understanding what happened, what is happening in terms of food security. There are people who were deeply involved in it, who will say it was the worst experience in their life. I call that chapter Food Fight, because in fact it did generate at points to, you thought people were going to start throwing pies at each other. And
but it's interesting that there's consensus on climate change among the scientists now, more or less, even though it's very heavily model-based.
Yes.
But that's not the case. It's not model-based when you talk about GMOs. I mean, the question about whether genetically modified organisms are safe is, you test it.
Yeah. A lot
Why
of
is there a debate in that sort of more tractable field than in the more speculative one?
I think some of it has to do with sort of fundamental issues about, are we messing around with nature? And have we broken some kind of a barrier by actually mixing organisms of different kinds in it? So what has been called in lurid terms the Frankenfood phenomenon, that we've gone beyond what, to me, for example, would seem like a logical extension of hybridization over the years. That kind of issue. And I think the other issue, which is not an issue of science, but is certainly a very important issue of public policy, has to do with the fact that GMOs have tended to be produced in a corporate context rather than as a global public good or by the state, and therefore come with licensing and other arrangements, and that therefore you're talking about the corporatization of agriculture, and that has to do with issues of equity and social production that are fairly fundamental. To my mind, my first exposure to GMOs was actually GMOs that were being done in public policy in India, within the state, in order to deal with critical issues to do with salt, the rise of salt in fields, and increasing drought. So I mean, I've seen important work that's been done on GMOs that has nothing to do with the corporate issues. But there's no question that for many of the people who are advocates, they're concerned as much by the vehicle, the sort of the corporatization of agriculture, as they are by the whole issue that we're messing around with nature.
Very interesting. Well, we'll be back one last time with Lucie Edwards. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So your third basket is biodiversity. So this is one we don't read about so much in the news as climate change or food security. So what's the state of play here on the relationship between science and public policy?
Well, biodiversity is an interesting one, because if you go back, you remember that the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came out of Rio, came out at the same time as the Convention on Biodiversity. And arguably, if you go back to that point in history, in 1992, the biodiversity was the bigger issue. The whole question of the future of the Amazon rainforest, for example, all of the issues to do with desertification and so on, we're getting a lot of attention. Since then, although the problems continue to be quite acute, we're losing species and we're losing various ecosystems at a very worrying rate, it hasn't received the attention. And many of the scientists in the whole area of biodiversity are quite convinced that one of the differences was the fact that climate change had the IPCC and had a way to be able to tell their story effectively and get it to the attention of policymakers. So they've been pressing quite hard to have an equivalent, what they call something like an IPCC for biodiversity. And in fact, in 2 weeks' time, the very first meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Environmental Services will be meeting in Bonn to create what will be the third intergovernmental panel. I like to say it's the when Harry met Sally approach, where we want to have what they're having. They really want to have the kind of access, attention, and the resources that come together on climate change to be able to deal with the global biodiversity, and to have a continuous way of assessing what's happening in the world to make a snapshot of what's happened.
How big is that community of scientists compared to the climate change community?
It's, I think it will probably start in the order of about 800 people. but it's worth pointing out that climate change started with well under 300. As they bring in people and as they figure out how they're going to deal with the agenda, they themselves will be growing. And they have some very hot issues. The whole question of bioprospecting is a very controversial one.
What is that?
Bioprospecting is how people, again, as kind of a corporate debate, companies come in, talk to indigenous people, find a product that potentially could cure cancer or something else, either process it themselves or make a compound based on it, and then market it and make a profit. The indigenous knowledge has sat with the community for a very long time. Do they get the recognition for what they knew and that they could participated in this process? Very big issue in the developing world. So those kinds of issues of bioprospecting are likely to be quite contentious within it. Indigenous knowledge in general, the whole question of what people know, First Peoples, traditional peoples, and then the larger question about how do we preserve nature when there's competing pressures, as we said, for agriculture and food security, to preserve the environment in areas like the Amazon. And I think this time, the whole international security issue, your babies, are going to be very important because, of course, the Congolese forest is one of our last great reserves in terms of biodiversity and is at the moment an appalling war zone. And how can we actually ensure the integrity and the preservation of species at a time when human beings are trampling everything and killing people and killing the environment.
So the Amazon and Congo, they're the two big rainforests.
Amazon, the Congo, and parts of Indonesia, yes.
Right. And now Brazil's a highly functioning state, and Congo is a failed state, utterly.
Yes.
How does that figure into problem solving when it comes to biodiversity? I mean, my impression is that the Congolese jungle is a relatively good condition compared to the Amazon. No, that's right.
I mean, one of the problems with the Congolese jungle is we don't know.
We don't know.
And a very important thing that will come out of the biodiversity assessment panel will be, in fact, an ability to begin to understand what's happening in some of these hotspots for which there's relatively little information. It's quite true that the Brazilians have made a remarkable effort in understanding what's going on and putting a lot of their Amazonian forest into national parks in order to preserve it. But there are a number of areas in this world where they're very, very important areas where we literally can't get in. I remember talking to one plant prospector in the Congo who had just come back from the Congo, and he said, "You're not going to believe me, Lucie, but there are dinosaurs still there." I mean, there is that sense that there's so much extraordinary wealth of biodiversity for which we don't know.
Well, maybe it's good that we can't get in there because we might destroy it if we got in there.
It would be very good, but we have a tendency to destroy it anyway.
So stepping back and sort of looking at all of these issues together, is there a takeaway for policymakers when it comes to interacting with scientists?
Yes, I think there is. I think the kinds of critical global problems that we're going to be dealing with in this century, which are things like climate change, food security, biodiversity, are infused with science. You can't really understand what's going on unless you've got a really clear understanding of the baseline information. We need to ensure that we've got that kind of information into our hands in an accessible and understandable kind of fashion. It does argue, for example, over better scientific education. There's also a series of problems which are probably best described as the output of science. You know, where we end up with products, and GMOs may be a case in point, where we have new inventions, we're not quite sure about the regulatory environment in order to manage them, where we definitely need to fully understand what's happening to be able to make sure that we're managing the policy process for the interests of the community. So I think I often call it a difficult marriage, but it's a very, very important marriage to learn how to make it work right. And whether through scientific interpreters, people who are bilingual and bicultural, or through other vehicles where scientists can have a healthy engagement with policymakers, we will end up with better quality science and better quality, definitely better quality public policy.
And these are things best handled at the global level rather than regionally or sub-regionally?
I'm inclined to say all of the above.
All of the above.
I've just done a paper about climate change in Africa where I recommended a regional IPCC. Just because I think that there isn't enough detail yet. It's certain clear, the scientists will tell you, about what's going on in Africa, and the links tend to be north-south rather than within Africa. This kind of a vehicle where scientists and policymakers come together can be a very useful vehicle regionally. We have a prototype in Canada, the International Joint Commission, which has been doing this work in terms of the health of the Great Lakes for virtually all of the last century, and it's such a successful institution, we never talk about it anymore. It would be very nice if by the end of this century we had a lot of these institutions and we were worrying over other things, because this was working well.
Well, thanks, Lucie, for coming in and sharing your insights with us. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience has as well. To the audience, please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.